I love the final moment of the book of John. We'll give him the full 3 years.
Yeah.
It's still a pretty big claim to say that if everything that Jesus did was written down, even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
Yeah.
That feels a little strong. Coming on a little strong, author of John.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan.
And I'm Dan Beecher.
And you're listening to the Data Over Dogma podcast, where we increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. How are things today, Dan?
Rocking and rolling, keeping it juicy.
Keeping it 100, huh?
Keeping it 100, yes.
All right.
A fun show coming up today.
Awesome.
We get to talk about a book that is not one that I even ever encountered my entire growing up, because it is part of the apocrypha.
Mm-hmm.
It is Second Applebee's, and we're gonna have some fun with that one.
Third Carabas after that.
Yeah, sure. And then we're gonna go into a taking issue, and the issue we're gonna take is one that, like, it isn't obvious right off the jump, but we're going to be talking about the washing of feet. It is a thing that happened quite a bit and was an interesting ritual, and maybe was way more interesting than we knew it was. We'll see when we get to it. That'll be a fun discussion.
Yeah.
But to start us off, let's do a chapter and verse.
All right.
All right, and this week's chapter and verse is in 2 Maccabees, chapter 7. Is that right?
Yeah. Should we talk a little bit about Maccabees?
Yeah, we should just and remind ourselves why it's not in all of the Bibles, and why the Catholics will remember it and the Protestants won't, etc.
Yeah, there actually there are 4 well-known books of Maccabees. It's generally the first 2 that are included in apocryphal texts, if those texts are included, and the Maccabees deal with the history of the rise of the Hasmonean kingdom. So the fighting back against the Seleucid rulers in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, when Jewish folks actually managed to regain a degree of independence and started what has become known as the Hasmonean kingdom. So these are the events that result in the celebration of Hanukkah, which commemorates the rededication of the temple after the Maccabean forces were able to take it back from the Seleucid forces. And
the Seleucids were... Is that related to Babylon? I don't know who the Seleucids were.
So this is one of the groups that arose after Alexander the Great's death, and his kingdom was fractured, and there were a bunch of different regions that were ruled over by regional powers. And so the Ptolemies, for instance, were in Egypt, and the Seleucids were around Syria, Palestine area.
Oh, okay.
And so these were Hellenistic rulers. And so Second Maccabees talks about actually a few different rulers: Seleucus IV, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Antiochus V, Demetrius I. So there are a few different Seleucid rulers that are discussed, but they're the ones who are trying to maintain their control over this territory while the Maccabees are fighting back and trying to gain independence.
Okay, and who are the Maccabees?
The Maccabees, this is a nickname that is given to a family that kind of becomes the head of this resistance movement. So Judas Maccabeus, for instance, is how one of the generals is known. And we've talked in the past a little bit about how there might be a hint at some kind of notion of purgatory in 2 Maccabees 12, where Judas Maccabeus and his forces come upon some fallen comrades, and they have contraband. They have idols on their persons, and so he passes the hat around to gather up a collection to send off to the Jerusalem temple so that sacrifices can be made in the names of the deceased, so that maybe they can have a better resurrection.
I do remember talking about that. That's really interesting. And the chapter in 2 Maccabees that we are going to talk about is actually also just jam-packed with theologically interesting little moments,
yes.
which you could totally miss if you're not looking for them.
Yeah.
But I as a guy who is peripherally associated with biblical scholarship, they jumped out at me quite. A few of them did. Maybe there's more.
Yeah.
But this is a story. It is in the NRSV UE. It is titled "The Martyrdom of Seven Brothers."
Yes,
and their mommy.
And their mother, yes. And the interesting thing about this is that there are actually multiple stories of a parent and seven sons facing death for their refusal to violate God's laws.
Oh.
So there's a text called The Assumption of Moses, where we have a character named Tacho, who is a father who takes his seven sons into a cave to protest Roman oppression in a later time period, and presumably killing his sons and then himself along the way. And then we have a discussion in Josephus, where Josephus tells the same story but expands on it and actually has the father killing the sons one by one rather than have them fall into Roman hands. And then we have some rabbinic literature as well that reflects this story. But we have a slightly different version in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, which I argued in a paper from many, many moons ago. 2009, I think, is when I actually published it in a student journal, where I suggested that because of the fact that it is chock full of theological significance, and also if we look at the trajectory of the development of this story seems to come from a later time period, I argued, hey, maybe we ought to date chapter 7 to later. Maybe it is a later addition to the text of 2 Maccabees, but that argument has not won over a ton of supporters. So I presented it in a couple different academic conferences, and was received skeptically, let's say.
Okay.
But there are a bunch of interesting things that we see in here. For instance, we have this notion of actually, let's just talk a little bit about the narrative, and then we can go through some of these elements.
Before we dive into that, give me a sense of the dating, the traditional dating or approximate dating of this text. Like when does this go back to?
So scholars suggest it was probably written somewhere between 161 BCE and about 63 BCE.
Okay.
It was obviously written after the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and it was almost certainly written before Pompey's annexation of Judea, because the Romans are not treated as villains in this. And if it had come after that, then they probably would have been treated as villains. And it starts in chapter 7. It happened also that, and we're telling stories about ways that the Seleucids are trying to stamp out observation of Jewish conventions.
Right.
Such as circumcision, such as avoidance of pork, and things like that. So it happened also that 7 brothers and their mother were arrested and were being compelled by the king under torture with whips and straps to partake of unlawful pig's flesh. And one of them, acting as their spokesman, said, "What do you intend to ask and learn from us? For we are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." And then this...
By the way, unlawful pig's flesh is a great name for a metal band. If anybody wants it, it's just hanging out there for you.
And then the king fell into a rage and gave orders to have pans and cauldrons heated.
Yeah, it gets real intense real fast.
Yeah. Well, you got to read 4th Maccabees, because that is like stretches it out. It expands the torture, and it expands the vocabulary that is used to describe the torture devices and the ways that the kids are tortured. But in short, one by one, the 7 sons are going to be tortured and killed.
And the torture is spelled out. They scalp them, and it seems to indicate that they are all sort of dispatched in the same manner, which I'm going to get to in a minute because I think there's a funny thing. But they are scalped, and then their hands and feet are cut off, while the rest of the brothers and the mother look on. Mm-hmm. And there is something about cutting out the tongue, isn't there?
Yes, that happens in verse 10. Okay. After him, the third was the victim of their sport. When it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hands and said nobly, I got these from heaven, and because of his laws, I disdain them, and from him I hope to get them back again. And
that right there is actually the first of our big theological moments, mm-hmm. right? Which is to say, at least from my perspective, it's the first mention that we get, at least in this chapter, of I'm going to be made whole. My his understanding of what was going to happen is if he is righteous, God will give him back his hands and feet and tongue.
Yeah. So this witnesses to a view of resurrection, which is something that developed slowly within Judaism, and this is would be a very early attestation to a rather developed view of resurrection. If he's like, oh, I'm getting all this back, and we have a few different mentions of this, and I think they're going oldest to youngest with these. And after he too had died, they maltreated and tortured the fourth in the same way, and then he cries out, and each of the sons before they are killed says something mean to the king.
Which is funny because the tongue cutting out thing is actually the first thing that happens to the first one. And if this all goes in the same order, then they all had their tongues cut out. And then later they were like, haha, but for you, there will be no resurrection, which is pretty funny. But that is verse 14. I'll just read it and then you can talk about it, because this is the fourth kid who's being killed. And when he dies, he says, or when he's near death, and by the way, they are frying these kids in a pan after they cut off all their hands and feet. So that's pretty horrific. But he says, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals and to cherish the hope God gives of being raised again by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection to life, which theologically, I suppose, means no hell, right? That's oblivion. That's It does seem to suggest that that he can't count on being raised again. In other words, the resurrection would only be for the righteous, unless resurrection to life stands in contrast to resurrection to something else. Oh. But I think the idea that cherish the hope God gives of being raised again by him, mm-hmm. if Antiochus does not have that hope, then maybe there is no resurrection of any kind that he can expect, and it's just annihilation. But it doesn't jive with a lot of what we see in later ideas where everybody is resurrected. But again, this is a slowly developing ideological framework. Yeah.
Then they brought forth the fifth and maltreated him. But he looked at the king and said, because you have authority among mortals, though you also are mortal, you do what you please, but do not think that God has forsaken our people. Keep on and see how his mighty power will torture you and your descendants. Quite the threat there. In the face of torture and murder. But we start to see the idea that the punishment that they are receiving is a just recompense for the sins of Israel.
Yeah, that was a bit of a befuddlement to me, because that theme is repeated multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that we are forsaken and our sin, this is happening to us because of our sins, which I thought was an interesting thing. Can you talk a little bit about why, what that's about? Because I don't know. I've read a lot of, you read the Psalms and they're sort of bemoaning our lot and God, why have you done this to us? But this seems very clear that bad things that are happening to us are our fault in some way, and somehow our atonement for our sins.
Yeah, you do have a sense that these punishments and this death functions as a kind of atonement, and that if they suffer it well, then that will appease God's anger or something like that.
Yeah.
The exilic literature, the earlier literature that's talking about Israel being sent into exile, pretty unilaterally suggests that the exile was punishment for Judah's sins. And so this later literature is probably just accepting that framing of persecution on the part of larger nations. Well, that must be because of the sins of the nation. But we do have a sense of kind of proxy atoning for others' sins here, which is kind of early, in my opinion, for this thing to be popping up in the literature, alongside a very early manifestation of belief in resurrection, a very early kind of ascetic approach to martyrdom.
Yeah.
Where he regarded his sufferings as nothing, which is not really a first century BCE Jewish ideal. That strikes me as something that comes a little later.
Huh.
But then we get a little after the 6, we get a little about the mother. In verse 20, the mother was especially admirable and worthy of honorable memory. Although she saw her 7 sons perish within a single day, she bore it with good courage because of her hope in the Lord. She encouraged each of them in the language of their ancestors. Filled with a noble spirit, she reinforced her women's reasoning with a man's courage, and said to them, I do not know how you came into being in my womb. I bet she does know. It was not I who gave you life and breath, nor I who set in order the elements within each of you. Therefore the Creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of humankind and divined the origin of all things, in his mercy gives life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of his laws. So again, we have this reference to they are sacrificing themselves in order to remain faithful to the laws, and so God will give life and breath back.
Right.
And here Antiochus is outraged, and so we only have the youngest brother left, and so Antiochus not only appealed to him in words, but promised with oaths that he would make him rich and enviable if he would turn from the ways of his ancestors, and that he would take him for his friend and entrust him with public affairs. Since the young man would not listen to him at all, the king called the mother to him and urged her to advise the youth to save himself. So it's representing Antiochus as just this out of control, just raging, barely human tyrant.
Well, I would say that in this moment, it's representing him as being someone who's like, I'm kind of trapped into this whole thing. I really need you to, I don't want to kill another kid. If I just eat the pork. It'll be fine. And when he doesn't do it, he's like, Mom, come here. Talk to him. I don't want to kill him. Talk to him. I'll make him rich. I'll make him, you know what I mean? Like, it feels to me like he's really working to make this not happen.
It also says in verse 24, he was suspicious of her reproachful tone. So I think he might be trying to be like, you smarmy little, trying to win them over to overcome their dogmatism.
Yeah.
And so he urges her, and then she leans in close to him, and she, in their native language,
Leans in close to her son.
Yeah. Derides the cruel tyrant and says, my son, have pity on me. I carried you 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years and have reared you and brought you up to this point in your life and have taken care of you. And this is verse 28. This is a very famous verse, and I'll explain why in a second. I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see everything that is in them and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed.
Yeah.
And in the same way the human race came into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers, accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you back again along with your brothers. And obviously this passage is appealed to by a bunch of folks as asserting creation ex nihilo.
Yeah.
Creation out of nothing.
It definitely, I mean, yeah, God did not make them out of things that existed.
Yes.
That does seem...
However, the very next sentence, and in the same way the human race came into being, rather complicates things
Sure.
because the human race did not come into being from nothing. If you look at Genesis 2, the human race was molded from the dust.
Made of dirt.
Made of dirt, yeah. Keep a little dirt under the pillow for
the dirt
Adam,
man.
the dirt man.
That's
Yeah.
right.
But there's a further problem. Most scholars these days acknowledge that this things that existed and things that did not exist. This is a reference to a Greek philosophical notion of matter as existing in a realm of being or a realm of non-being. Where matter that existed in the realm of non-being was still matter and it existed. It was just part of this material substrate that lacked form and function. It was the raw materials. And so to give it form and function was to move it from the realm of non-being into the realm of being. And so there have been a handful of scholars since like the 70s and 80s who've been pointing out this is not creation ex nihilo. This is not creation out of nothing. And the fact that this creation of the world out of things that did not make them out of things that existed, if that's the same way the human race came into being, then it's very clearly not creation ex nihilo. Yes. But the young man then turns and says, well, what are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command, but I obey the command of the law that was given to our ancestors through Moses. And basically further mouths off to Antiochus, says, our brothers have fallen under God's covenant, but you, by the judgment of God, will receive just punishment for your arrogance. I, like my brothers, give up body and life for the laws of our ancestors, appealing to God to show mercy soon to our nation, and by trials and plagues to make you confess that he alone is God. And through me and my brothers to bring to an end the wrath of the Almighty that has justly fallen on our whole nation. So again, this is expiation for sin. This is proxy atonement for sin by them giving up their lives for their nation.
Yeah. I mean, you skipped it, but it does say in verse 32, for we are suffering because of our own sins.
Yes.
So yeah, that is fascinating. The idea of proxy atonement. Does that ever come up later in the Bible at all? Does that? It seems like maybe that comes up.
It's in the back somewhere, I think. And then it says, the king fell into a rage and handled him worse than the others, being exasperated at his scorn. So he died in his integrity, putting his whole trust in the Lord. Last of all, the mother died after her sons. And then verse 42, let this be enough then about the eating of sacrifices and the extreme tortures. So the author has had enough. The author is done.
That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah.
Is a weird way to end a biblical chapter. That just seems like a very odd thing to say, but yes.
Yeah. But this is a part of the literature of this time period where they're like, and now I'm going to go on to talk about this, and let that be enough of that. And
then that thus endeth that lesson.
Yes.
Well,
so
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's the story of the mother and her 7 sons, and represents Antiochus IV Epiphanes in not a very favorable light, as kind of not in control of his temper, and destined for not a great afterlife if the 7 sons were correct,
or not an afterlife at all,
depending on when we date this and what they're thinking about yon afterlife.
Yeah. All right. Fascinating, interesting, and again, one that many of us would never have encountered. I was far older than I should have been before I realized that's actually still in a lot of people's Bibles. All right.
And there are a number of other fascinating stories in Second Maccabees, and First Maccabees is considered slightly more historical, not incredibly historical, but slightly more historical, and is important for reconstructing the history of this time period. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we may have to come back to Applebee's at some point.
Read your Maccabees, people.
Yeah. Important stuff. All right. Let's move on to taking issue. All right. And the thing we're taking issue with today is feet.
Yes, we are. There are no fetishes going on here. We are.
We do not. Yeah. This is not a Tarantino film. We are not into it.
No pictures will be taken. No pictures will be shared.
Although if you check my OnlyFans, you will get some feet things. Anyway, I have one fan. What I've got pulled up is John 13.
John chapter 13.
And
yes.
And that is where Jesus washes his disciples' feet.
Mm-hmm.
They have a meal, and then after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him.
Yes.
And you wanted to talk about this, so I'm just going to let you. What is interesting? I've always, this has always to me been presented as a gesture of supplication or a gesture of service.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me about what's interesting, what we're taking issue with.
Well, we're taking issue with an interpretation of this that is pretty common in the world of social media, in the public discourse.
Oh.
Not as much in the academic discourse, but to some degree in the academic discourse. There's the notion that feet are euphemisms for genitals in the Bible.
Yeah, you've mentioned that a number of times as we've talked through things.
Yeah, and to uncover one's feet can be a euphemism for dropping trow. And to cover one's feet is a euphemism for defecation.
Oh,
because you're squatting down and
okay,
things
and
gather around one's feet.
Okay.
And so there are folks who suggest that this is a homoerotic story, that there is something a little more than washing going on between Jesus and his disciples. And I think if there were just a passage that said, and Jesus washed his disciples' feet or uncovered his disciples' feet or something like that, I mean, maybe there's a bit more of an argument to make there if it's something that's just in passing. But this is a part of a pretty symbolic set of events toward the end of John's gospel, and the details in here just don't leave room, in my opinion, for interpreting this as reflecting these sexual undertones.
Well, I'm just going to complicate the matter a little bit because the reading that I did started with verse 5, but
yes,
if I start before that,
yes,
in verse 4, Jesus got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist.
Yes.
Now, why did he strip? That seems odd.
Yeah, I would suggest that what's going on here is that he is doffing his symbols of his equality with the disciples and donning the clothing of an enslaved person. Because in this time period, washing feet was something that happened frequently, and you might wash your own feet, but usually if you were well enough off, you would have enslaved folks who would do it for you and your guests.
Okay.
And so to wash someone else's feet was to take a subordinate, a position of subordinate social status, and basically the position of an enslaved person. Can
you talk about the word that is translated here as towel? Because that's that might shed a little light.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just pull up what we're looking at here. I don't have my my Greek up. Taking a towel, which is lention. So this could be cloth. This could be apron. Let me see what BDAG says: linen cloth or towel. And we have of a woman who is preparing to wash another person's feet. So according to Vitae Asopi, which evidently comes from the 1st century CE. I'm not familiar with this text, but the life of Aesop. A woman would wrap themselves in a towel before washing another person's feet. So it sounds like this is imagery that is kind of part of the convention of foot washing.
Yes. Okay.
And sounds like it.
But it also puts it puts an interesting further complication into this, which is that now is Jesus taking on a woman's role, and that actually becomes that's a very interesting question to me.
Yeah, I would have to look at the literature to see if there's something significant about this being a woman, or if this is just an enslaved person who happens to be a woman, or maybe they're not an enslaved person at all. Yeah. I don't know. I think there are multiple different conventions, but the conventional reading on the part of scholars is that Jesus is debasing himself,
right,
humbling himself before his disciples in a symbolic gesture.
Right.
To show that what he's doing. And verse 5, then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. And so here's where like the details, the narrative details are a little too explicit for this to be a euphemistic reference to something else going on.
Yeah, it does sound very specific.
Yeah. And verse 6, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And this is kind of the incredulous Peter saying, no way this is happening. Jesus answered, you do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean, and you are clean, though not all of you. And then, we cut to Jim side-eye.
Right.
But, and so I think the idea here is that Peter misunderstands the symbol.
Yeah.
Peter thinks that Jesus is like, it's time to get y'all squeaky clean. And Peter's like, well, my scalp's been feeling a little dry. So he's like, ooh, get all the rest of me too. And Jesus kind of says, this is a symbol, Peter. This is not, I'm not suggesting you all need a bath. I'm
clean already. Just let me do the foot thing. Gosh.
Yeah. Because, you have a bath, you go walk around, your feet are dirty.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
especially in sandals in the desert.
Yes.
That seems like that's just A recipe for dirty feet.
Yeah, and so the idea here is that Jesus is humbling himself before his disciples as a sign of what's coming, and this is a symbolic way to kind of bring them into what's going to happen, and there are a variety of ways to explain what's going on. Explain the symbolism. But verse 11 says, "For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason, he said, 'Not all of you are clean.'" Dum dum dum.
Yeah.
And we get Jim's side eye. After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had reclined again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you?" Which would be a weird thing if this were sexual in some way. "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, slaves are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." And then, we get back to talking about how Judas is a naughty boy.
Yeah. So it's a message of equality, and sort of,
well, mutual submission and subordination, kind of servant leadership. You're not greater than me, but I humbled myself before you, and so obviously you guys got to humble yourselves before each other and before others. And so it's putting that burden on them to then live that example that Jesus has set, which they are going to do later on once Jesus is resurrected and they all come to their senses, because they're kind of blinded by their expectations of what the Messiah is going to be. And
yeah, I guess I actually misread when you just read the part about no servant is greater than his master. I actually, in my mind, I had that flipped. So it's not about equality. I was thinking it was a message of equality, but no, it's a message of you're not better than me, so you better act right.
Yeah, you're not better than me, but I still did this.
Right.
And so, it is kind of, he's like, I am humbling myself before you, even though I am greater than all of you put together.
Yeah, so, I am still way better than you, but if I'm so much better than you and I deigned to do this, you better be deigning. You guys better deign.
Yeah. And I'm trying to find out where he says this, because this is toward the end of John. I want to bring up something else interesting. There are a lot of peculiarities about John's telling of the final week of Jesus's life. But for instance, this meal that they sit down and have that immediately precedes some discourses and then his arrest is not represented as the Passover meal in John.
Oh, right.
It's the Passover meal in the Synoptics, but here it doesn't seem to be a Passover meal. But we have some more sermonizing, and then at the end of chapter 14, Jesus says, "But I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Rise, let us be on our way. I am the true vine." And Jesus is like, all right, everybody, let's get out of here. And then chapter 15 begins with more sermonizing. Chapter 16 has more sermonizing. And then we get to chapter 18. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay. So a lot of scholars have pointed out, we've got Jesus saying, you could skip right from the end of chapter 14 to the beginning of chapter 18 and miss nothing. Narratively, it just flows just fine. But it seems like an editor was like, I got 3 chapters worth of sermonizing. I got to put somewhere. And so we have our true vine speech, and we have the world hatred speech. And And then we have the intercessory prayer, and all of this gets shoved right in between Jesus saying, let's get out of here, and then the verse that says, so they got out of there.
Right, yeah.
One of a handful of different cues, little indications that there's been a heavy editorial hand in the Gospel of John.
And perhaps additions placed in there.
Yes, absolutely. Perhaps some things were cooked up to expand on the significance.
Like the book's not long enough. Can we add? Is there anything we can put in there?
Well, and we know this happens in the Gospel of John because the story of the woman taken in adultery.
Oh, right.
Was not original to the Gospel of John. Was not in the earliest manuscripts, but that is John chapter 7, verse 53 is where it starts, and it runs all the way through chapter 8, verse 11. And so we know about that one because we have manuscripts that don't have it, and that is not the case for chapters 15, 16, and 17. But certainly there is opportunity for editorializing going on, and I think one of the clearest indicators of that is at the very end. The first time I read this, I was like, "What? What?" So this is John chapter 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. And I was like, wait a minute. Who's we?
Right.
And
perhaps it was dictated.
Where does we stop and the beloved disciple start? And so that is always, I've always found that a funny little, somebody was like, let's just mention ourselves in here.
Either just chuck ourselves into this.
Yeah. The narrator or whoever is collating the text, just couldn't help but squeeze themselves, in there a little bit. And then they go, but there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written, which is a peculiar little epilogue that goes back to first person singular.
Yeah.
But I love that we've got this little we tossed in there. And so I think that demonstrates, like, even if you think the Gospel of John was written firsthand by an eyewitness, there's at least that one passage that very clearly was added later, and there've got to be others. We know the woman taken in adultery is another example, and so I think it's just the compositional history of the Gospel of John is a fascinating area of research that I would love to know more about. I haven't.
Remind me a little bit. When do we think John was written? Like in the order of the Gospels?
A lot of people.
Mark was first, right?
Mark was first. A lot of people think John was last, probably in the 90s CE. Okay. But if Luke is the early 2nd century CE, then Luke probably came after John.
Okay.
But yeah, that's something that's still being debated. And we've got a book. There it is, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics by James W. Barker.
Okay.
Where he makes a case that basically every gospel author used everything that came before. So Matthew used Mark, Luke used Matthew and Mark, and then John used all of the synoptics.
Okay.
So yeah, there are a handful of different theories about how everything came together, but usually John's dated to the 90s CE.
Yeah. I love as you point out, the final moment of the book of John, where because the ministry of Jesus was what, a year or something?
Well, in John, it's 3 years. Another big difference between the synoptics and John.
Okay. We'll give him the full 3 years.
Yeah.
It's still a pretty big claim to say that if everything that Jesus did was written down, even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
Yeah.
That feels a little strong. Coming on a little strong, author of John.
Yeah, maybe he had extra hours. Maybe he had more than 24 hours in each day that he was going about doing stuff as an itinerant preacher who probably spent a lot of time just hanging out. So
yeah,
that is some hyperbole there.
The book of Jesus chillin' would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, all right. That's I'm fascinated. John is a very interesting book. I really we should probably do more John stuff. Maybe we'll get your friend on.
We've got to. We've got a handful of folks who are waiting to get scheduled. Yeah. But
it might be a minute where our schedules are crazy. I don't know if our listeners know this, but you just had a book come out.
I did just have a book come out. The Bible says so. What we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues. And I feel bad that I have to say the subtitle every time. Because as I've pointed out, I am not responsible for the subtitle.
Well, you don't. I don't know why you feel bad that you have to, because you don't have to. You can just say the Bible. Look for a blue and yellow cover wherever you get your fine books, whatever local bookshop you go to for your favorite nonfiction books. Anyway, that's it for the show today. If you would like to become one of the many wonderful people who help make this show happen, we would love to have you over on patreon.com. Where you can sign up to get access to early and ad-free versions of every show. You can get access to the after party, which is bonus content that we do for our patrons every week, and it also just makes us feel warm and fuzzy and keeps us actually paid so that we can afford to keep doing this. So we really appreciate that. If you would like to reach out to us, it's contact@dataoverdogmapod.com. Thanks so much to Roger Gowdy for editing the show. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We'll talk to you again next week.
Bye, everybody.